Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Passages Pulse. My name is Josiah McGee. I'm your co-host of this podcast. I'm joined by a very special guest that I will introduce in a moment. Just for some context, because we're going to be talking about some events that we expect to happen next week. We are actually recording this episode on a Friday, about 2 p.m. Eastern on Friday, September 19th. And again, we do expect this information to be very relevant in the coming few days, starting next week. So a bit of background before we introduce our guest. The reason why we're having this conversation is because we expect some drama to unfold at the UN General Assembly meetings in New York next week. Most specifically, there are several countries which have indicated that they have plans to or have committed to formally recognize the Palestinian state during those meetings next week. Among the bigger names would be countries like France or the UK. I should say some of the more surprising names of countries that have committed to recognize the Palestinian state. And of course, with that, you also have in the background a number of officials who've been working on various plans for the day after the war in Gaza and debating and discussing whether that should or should not include a Palestinian state. Just in the last couple of days, there have been news reports coming out about Tony Blair having potentially finished a proposal for a day after plan in Gaza, which would include some transfer of control to the Palestinian Authority. He, of course, has lots of thoughts on this, as well as our guest, who has many things to say about the future of the Palestinian Authority and the idea of a Palestinian state. So without further ado, I do want to introduce him because, again, we are very excited to have you here today, Mr. Elliott Abrams. Thank you for being with us. I'll introduce you, and then you can add anything that you'd like to as way of introducing yourself. Okay. He is the chairman of the Tikva Fund, as well as chairman of the Vandenberg Coalition, and senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. He served as special assistant to the president and NSC senior director for the Near East and North Africa in the first term of George W. Bush, and as deputy assistant to the president and deputy national security advisor in the second term. In the Trump administration, he also served in the State Department as special representative for Iran and for Venezuela. He is the author of several books and writes widely on U.S. foreign policy with a special focus on the Middle East and issues including democracy and human rights. So, as you can tell, a very accomplished individual with a long record of public service. Thank you, Mr. Abrams, for that public service and for joining us today. Is there anything else that you would like to say about yourself before we jump into this?
No, glad to be here and look forward to talking with you.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. Well, the conversation, like I said, we're going to be having is primarily about the idea of a Palestinian state and these plans to formally recognize one starting next week. There are, I think, a number of questions that I had as soon as I heard about that news, including what is a Palestinian state exactly? Why have these world leaders chosen this time and this context to recognize a Palestinian state? And what are some of the likely consequences of that? Are there any alternatives that are being pushed to the side and we should be discussing? You know, lots of things that we could be discussing today, but I also want to mention to the audience, you recently wrote a long form article for Mosaic Magazine, which we'll make sure is in the show notes for listeners so that they can read it after if they'd like to. The title, which very interesting. It was an interesting title right off the bat, piques my interest. There will never be a Palestinian state. A very strong statement to make, I think. So what's next was the last part of that title. In it, you basically criticize the prevailing logic that a lot of these leaders, especially the French, have been using to justify their decision to recognize a Palestinian state. Basically, they've argued it will undercut Hamas, uplift the PA, the Palestinian Authority, end the reason for conflict, and bring peace. Can you elaborate on why you think that logic is flawed?
Yeah. It is a very long article. I'm glad you warned people who may be turning to it. These countries that you mentioned, France, England, there are others, Australia, Canada, Luxembourg just jumped on, but that's probably not the most important. They didn't recognize a Palestinian state 2 years ago. It's only now, after the October 7th attack by Hamas, that they're saying they're going to do it. And there's a great risk, and this is a risk that's been referred to by President Trump and by Secretary of State Rubio, that it's a kind of reward to Hamas. That is, the lesson to Palestinians is, you don't get this from sitting down at a negotiating table. You get this by killing Jews. You get this by invading Israel, and that I think is a great danger here. Um, the larger question, I'd say, is why hasn't this happened? That is, how come there's no Palestinian state? People have been talking about this for, well, really for a century. And the British government had the Palestine Mandate under the League of Nations after World War I. And they said, look, we need to divide this mandate between a Jewish state and an Arab state. And the UN said the same thing in the UN Security Council resolution at the end of World War II. Resolution 181 said partition, Jewish state, Arab state. And what I argue in the article is that though the Jewish state that they came up with was very small, much smaller than today's Israel, the Jews, the Zionist movement, said, okay, we'll take what we can get. And the Arab side said, no way, we will never agree to a Jewish state. And what I argue is that that's really the problem, that even today, they don't accept the reality of a Jewish state. Palestinian nationalism has not been a kind of constructive nationalism about building a country, building a state, bottom up, institutions, schools, highways. It's been about destroying the Jewish state, which they view as a kind of illegal settlement, the whole thing as a kind of illegal settlement that needs to be extirpated.
There was an interesting bit in your article, I think, about recent work that's been done by Robert Malley, I think, who actually wrote a book on this. Yeah. If you wouldn't mind, could you just share with the listeners the name of that book as well, your thoughts on, does that agree with or differ in any way from your assessment?
The book is called Tomorrow is Yesterday, and it's by two men who have been long-term peace negotiators. Robert Malley's an American who worked for President Clinton and President Obama and President Biden on the peace negotiations. And the other author, Hussein Aga, is an Arab who has spent most of his life at Oxford University in England and was a peace negotiator for Yasser Arafat and the Palestinians. And in this book, what was so striking about it is that they say there comes a point when you have to say, we've been trying this forever and it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. And that is what they say about the two-state solution, that they say, look, we've been working on this our whole professional lives. There are reasons it has not happened. They are still persuasive reasons, and we need to start thinking about other paths to the future.
Sure. So one of the things I thought was really interesting about the article that you wrote was you also had some strong things to say about the Palestinian Authority and the role that it's played in remaining an obstacle, because it is not so different from Hamas. And I think this is something also that Robert Malley also argued, that it's not so different from Hamas on the question of a two-state solution. More so it differs on matters of religion or governance, things of that nature, which is a really interesting take. I think if you know the history of the Palestinian Authority and the First and Second Intifada, then that adds some helpful color to that, obviously, reasons why people believe that to be true. But you made the argument that the PA, even if it was interested in a two-state solution, cannot be trusted to reform institutions that continue to provide an incentive for both corruption and violence, whether that's the pay for slave policy, which has been a big part of the debate in the last year about whether or not the PA can be given control of Gaza again, is can they reform key policies like that, or the payments made to Palestinian terrorist families. And they've made promises to various countries, especially France, that they will commit to reformation of different policies and governance structures, that sort of thing. But you don't trust them. Can you elaborate on that? Why? And is there anything that they could do that would change your mind, or is this just inherent to the way that the PA has been built?
I would start by saying Palestinians have been cursed by bad leadership. Sometimes you get lucky and you get George Washington, or South Africa, you get Nelson Mandela. And sometimes you don't. And they've had really terrible leadership. First, a Grand Mufti under the British, Amin al-Husseini, who was a Nazi, spent the Second World War years in Berlin with Hitler. And then Yasser Arafat, who was a terrorist. And now Mahmoud Abbas, who was elected in 2006 for a 4-year term, has not permitted an election since then, and has done none of the things that you would want to do to build a state. What's striking to me here is these promises that Abbas has been president, again, since 2005, actually. The presidential election was 2005. Yasser Arafat died in the fall of 2004. Abbas comes in 2005. That's 20 years ago. Well, what's he been doing? If he really means to do any of these reforms, he's had 20 years to try and has not tried. So now he says to President Macron of France, to the British Prime Minister and so on, I promise to do A, B, C. He should not be doing those things as promises to foreigners. If they're good things to do, to fight terrorism, to fight corruption, to build schools and hospitals and the institutions of a state, he ought to do those for the Palestinian people. He hasn't done them in these 20 years in power. So now he writes a letter to these world leaders and says, now I will do them. You know, I don't see why anybody would take those pledges seriously. There have been Palestinians who believed in state building. When I was in the Bush administration, the Palestinian finance minister, then prime minister, was Salam Fayyad, and he absolutely believed in it. He even kind of drew an analogy to the Zionist movement and the way it built up Israel. And he said, Israel wasn't created in 1948. It was announced in 1948 after decades of building those institutions. And that's what he tried to do, but he had very little support. And when he ran in the parliamentary election in 2006, he got literally 2.4% of the vote. The Fatah Party and Hamas got the bulk of the vote, each of them getting around 40%. So when President Abbas has done none of this for 20 years, the notion that he writes you a letter and you say, oh, okay, now I see he'll change at the age of 89, I just don't take that very seriously. And I don't quite understand why anybody takes it seriously.
No, I definitely agree that there's been more than enough time to make some changes. I do want to maybe ask you an interesting question. If this is just about bad leadership or if your concerns go any deeper than that. And I'll give you a hypothetical, for example. One of the things that has been most interesting, if you're following, our listeners should be familiar with this, that they've been following the podcast, some recent polling that came out of the Palestinian territories by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. They periodically do their polls on all sorts of issues related to the war, but also Palestinian leadership and election polling. And it's pretty clear that if there was an election that was only between Hamas leadership and Abbas, Hamas leadership would win because of his concern over his age and his corruption or propensity towards it, reputation for it at the very least. But there is also an interesting hypothetical in which if you allowed another Fatah official, hypothetically Barghouti, to return from exile, then he would beat Hamas in an election and potentially have a better shot at making some change happen. So I suppose my question is the issue limited to any one individual like Abbas, and if he were removed, would there be better prospects for reform and building Palestinian institutions if you brought in someone like Barghouti? Or is this more endemic to Palestinian society? What would need to happen in order to reverse this trend, I suppose?
That's a key question. I do think leadership matters. What there isn't is, again, a kind of George Washington sitting around. At 89, we know that President Abbas is probably not going to be president terribly much longer. Marwan Barghouti is another Fatah official. He's in prison in Israel. He's in prison for participating in terrorist acts. Would he be a great leader? The people around Abbas, he's never really appointed a kind of vice president and successor. They're not very impressive. So that is a problem. But there's a deeper problem. You see it in the opinion polls. Hamas has a lot of support. Whether it would, last time in that 2006 vote, it got 44% of the vote. Fatah got 41. It's pretty close. In elections now, again, depending on who's leading which party, again, they get 30-40% of the vote, sometimes more. And there are other things in the polls, like the use of violence. Do people approve the use of violence to get their political goals? Mm-hmm. And a lot do. It's worth saying here, by the way, that in those polls, that Palestinian Center asks Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza, do you favor a two-state solution? And it never gets 50%. I mean, it's really quite striking. Palestinians are not in love with that idea. Now we get to the deeper problem, which is not just leadership. It's what I was trying to argue before, that the deeper goal for many, many Palestinians is the elimination of the state of Israel. It isn't just building a Palestinian state. And if you say, well, they don't have a majority, they'd only get 45% of the vote. And my God, I mean, you're trying to create a Palestinian state, half of whose citizens or 45% of whose citizens are dedicated to eliminating, destroying the state of Israel. If that's right, then creating that state's a formula for war, not peace. That is, Crone and the British and the Canadians, etc., all seem to think, just create the Palestinian state. July 4th, they have a new state. The problem is solved, and there will be no more violence. But if it is true that many, many Palestinians, as I'm arguing and as I think poll data would show, have as a deeper goal destroying the state of Israel, then you have not solved the problem by creating a Palestinian state. You may have exacerbated it. You may have exacerbated it because, first, a lot of Palestinians may think, including Hamas supporters, well, step one, we got our own state, and now it's a launching pad. Now we go to stage two, which is we use that state to attack Israel. Secondly, Israel is now very active, that is to say, the Israeli army in the West Bank. If the West Bank is a state, UN member, full-fledged, full sovereignty state, then every Israeli move against terrorist groups, including Hamas in the West Bank, is an act of war. It's a violation of an international border. So it seems to me that what's put forward as a magic formula to bring peace, creation of a Palestinian state, runs a very great risk of exacerbating the crisis.
I think there's an interesting headline that I was reading just last night and this morning about an IDF raid in the West Bank yesterday, in which it was discovered actually that the rocket manufacturing capabilities have transferred from Gaza to the West, ourselves in the West Bank, trying to manufacture rockets, and have successfully tested, not long distances, I think only 2 kilometers, but still you can imagine a world in which if that capability improved, and you've seen what Hamas is capable of doing, launching rockets from Gaza, then yes, it would be a very serious issue if you had to suddenly contend with that kind of conflict or those kinds of weapons on
It's
two
worth
fronts.
mentioning in the context of your remark, Iran, because one of the great problems here is, there's one country that is constantly saying death to Israel, death to America, and it's Iran, of course, the Islamic Republic, and they are doing everything they can to bring money and guns into the West Bank. And that's another problem for Palestinian statehood. That is, they would see it as a launching pad for more and larger attacks on Israel.
Absolutely. Yeah, the geography makes this a very complicated situation, obviously. I do want to go back to your article because there's something in there that I just couldn't put down or stop thinking about as I was reading through it and then reflecting on the article. Of course, much of the article is reflecting on the shortcomings of the Palestinian Authority, of Palestinian nationalism and its leadership, and trying to hold accountable the choices that they've made or hold them accountable to those choices. You opened an interesting door, though, to another part of this conversation where you also said that Western countries, including the United States, bear some partial responsibility for failure to build Palestinian state institutions. And of course, you argued it needs to be done patiently, and that's part of the problem is that it hasn't been. But I guess my question would be twofold, because it's really interesting. You're suggesting it's not entirely the fault of the Palestinians or the Arab world that this project of Palestinian statehood has failed. It's also partially the fault of Western countries and even the United States. So what went wrong? I mean, what could we have done differently? And how should we approach this now? What should we be doing now in light of the fact that we may in part be partially responsible for this mess that we're all in?
Yeah. What I meant by that was my own experience, which was, we go back to the days, this is, say, 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, when you have Salam Fayyad as the finance minister, then prime minister. He's not doing anything flashy. Building a school here, paving a road there, not flashy. Publishing a budget for the first time, not flashy. And unfortunately, we, meaning the West, and that means the European countries, and it means us. We're frequently focused on things like peace talks. Let's get the Palestinians and the Israelis to Camp David. Let's get them to the White House lawn. Let's get them to the UN together. And nobody ever said what Fayyad is doing is wrong. Everybody always said, oh yeah, it's wonderful. He's great. He's really great. But when it came to it, we tended to turn more toward the negotiations, the summits, the meetings, the White House lawn, than that boring and incredibly important day after day after day work of state building. And I think that's, I guess, my main criticism now of, all these guys who want to go to the UN General Assembly. It would be September 23rd and 4th for most of them, and make their big announcement about a Palestinian state, an announcement that does not help one Palestinian feed his or her family, doesn't improve one schoolroom, but it's a big splash. It's why we're talking about it. It's a major international event. And I think we, and I would say the Arabs too, when you had someone in that brief period of years who was really dedicated to building bottom up, we all said, that's nice. That's really nice. But we didn't give him the support of the kind of strength, power, money that might, because we'll never know, but might have made things better. Could he have overcome the forces, including, of course, Hamas, above all, that are just trying to destroy Israel? We'll never know.
So I don't want to sound overly naive or optimistic or eager, but I suppose the question that in my mind that begs is, does that mean it's too late? I mean, is the argument that we had a window of opportunity, we missed it, and there's no do-over of trying it this slow, patient way?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Well, I still believe in the idea of partition. The idea that the British came up with 90 years ago, the idea that the UN General Assembly had in 1947, which is to have a Jewish entity and a Palestinian entity. And I think the question is, what kind of entity? What are we talking about here? One of the things I object to in President Macron of France said it recently, the Biden administration said it probably 10 times a year. Why Palestinian state? There is no alternative. But see there is no alternative. End the debate. No discussion. There is no alternative. I think it's much more sensible to say, okay, if you start from the idea that separating this Palestinian entity is a good idea, to have the greatest possible degree of self-rule. But it doesn't look as if a state is going to work. Palestinians don't seem to be all that much in love with it. The Israelis are certainly afraid of it. What are alternatives? Are there any alternatives? And in that article, I mentioned one that in that book by Mali and Hussein Aga is also mentioned, which is what's frequently called the Jordanian option. Between 1948 and 1967, the West Bank was actually part of Jordan. Gaza was part of Egypt. Half the population of Jordan is actually Palestinian. So the argument I make in the article is, well, why not think about that? If you create this Palestinian entity in the West Bank, it's poor. It has no natural resources. It has no port. It has no international airport. The logic is it's got to confederate with a country that has all those things: international recognition, an army, a police force, an economy, a port, an airport. There are two candidates geographically, Israel and Jordan. So which makes more sense, a confederation with a Jewish Hebrew-speaking state or with a Muslim Arabic-speaking state, Jordan? And what I argue, and Mali and Aga do too, we come at this from very different positions, but on this we agree. We ought to think, the international community as it's known, should think this through. And the argument would be, you want to end the, quotes, occupation of the West Bank, let Palestinians have a very significant amount of self-rule, of self-government, with the King of Jordan in charge of security and military matters, so that they'd be part of that real existing state, but with as much self-rule as possible. And I give you an example of, people sometimes say, well, where is that ever? Kurdistan. Kurdistan is a province of Iraq, but the Kurds have very substantial amount of self-government, of autonomy.
I think this is absolutely fascinating. I also have so many questions. So if you don't mind a few more minutes, I'd like to ask you some follow-up questions on this Confederation idea. I'm with you that I think the idea of recognizing a Palestinian state as currently constituted seems like it's mostly style over substance. There's not a lot of real substance what that practically would mean. I don't think it would benefit most Palestinians. Certainly seems like it would be a security risk to the region to incentivize organizations like Hamas to continue choosing violence. So all of that makes sense. The necessity of an alternative also makes a lot of sense. But when I think about this confederation, what's that?
There's a but coming here.
Well, so there's a couple of things. I'm just curious because you haven't touched on them yet, and so I want to give you an opportunity to explain how this would work in your mind. The first one, I guess the first but, if you want to call it that, is, but what about Gaza? This is a stronghold of Palestinian nationalism, and historically speaking, unfortunately, violent Palestinian nationalism. It's part of why Hamas is so strong there, and it's not geographically connected to the West Bank. So the arguments that it could be part of a confederation that shares a border with Jordan, I don't think they would necessarily work. So is the argument that it would be a part of this confederation? Is it that it would need to form its own second confederation with Egypt because it shares a border with Egypt? Is it just going to continue to be this Hamas-run enclave indefinitely? I mean, where does it fit into this vision?
You've asked the hardest question about Gaza.
Try.
And as I said, I mean, Gaza was not part of Jordan. It was part of Egypt. It was ruled by Egypt. Even if you created a Palestinian state in the next 5 or 10 years, Gaza would be a horrendous problem for the reasons that you stated. My view is if you could create something good in the West Bank, let's suppose you created this, let's call it Palestinian entity, so that you have the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan now. Maybe it's the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and Palestine. And it was well ruled by the king and the government. And you began to see improvement, peace, economic development. Meanwhile, it's separate from Gaza. And whatever comes out of the Gaza war, people are now talking about, you mentioned Tony Blair at the beginning, Blair's plan for a big international committee to rebuild Gaza. One would hope that at the end of that, and maybe we're talking about 10 years from now, or maybe more, that's what Gazans would want. They would say, we want to be part of a real country, a real state that is at peace, that is growing, that's a decent place to raise our children. That would be the long-term hope. But before we get there, Hamas has to be defeated, and maybe even more difficult than that. Hamas has been in control of the West Bank since of Gaza since 2007. So 18 years, you've got a whole generation that's been completely brainwashed by Hamas. I mean, that's what they're teaching, a whole generation. And that's got to be changed. So it may take actually 10 or 20 years, which is to say most of a generation. But in the end, I would think you could have several Palestinian, not just one, parts of this larger kingdom. One may be the West Bank, one may be Gaza. Others have suggested you could divide up the West Bank in the sense that, you've got cities there, Jenin, Ramallah, Hebron, that could actually want to be little provinces of their own with a greater degree of local self-rule. This is all, considerably far in the future. And I mean, when I say considerably far, I mean, I think we're talking 10 to 25 years.
Last question for you. And I appreciate you reminding us of the importance of thinking big picture and patiently. So that's a good reminder. Thank you for that. But my last question for you is, do you think this is realistic, that it would be accepted? And I'll explain the reason for my question. There's a couple of reasons. One, to this point, we've assumed that Palestinian nationalism, in your estimation, is maximalist in nature, that it doesn't want to coexist alongside a state of Israel, that part of the definition of a Palestinian state is one that exists on what is currently Israel proper, the state of Israel's territory. there's also been recent events recently, just in the last week, border crossing at the Allenby border crossing with Jordan, or Jordanian actually, approached as a driver for humanitarian aid to Gaza, got out of his truck and shot two Israelis, and was eventually shot, and then his body returned to the Jordanian authorities. But there's some pretty deep issues, I think, within the Palestinian society and within Palestinians living in Jordan as it relates to their willingness to coexist. Even Palestinians in Jordan, their willingness to coexist there with Israel seems to be weak at times. So do you think the popular will for a solution like this exists? Is this actually realistic given what we've discussed about the nature of Palestinian nationalism?
I try to be somewhat optimistic. I think the point you're making is a powerful and sad one, because the answer may be no, it doesn't exist. We have seen a change in the region in the sense that, it's not the 1940s or 50s or 60s anymore. There were peace treaties between Jordan and Israel, Egypt and Israel. The Abraham Accords that President Trump arranged in his first term with Morocco, Bahrain, the Emirates, where they normalized relations with Israel, suggest that at least in parts of the Arab world, there is a desire for peaceful existence. There is an acceptance of Israel as a Jewish state. Palestinians have been unwilling to do that. The hope would be, particularly after this really bloody war in Gaza and following the October 7th attack, the hope would be that over time that changes, that Palestinians join in a change that has begun to happen. I mean, we're seeing with the defeat of Hezbollah a change in Lebanon. We may be seeing a change in Syria. It's too early to tell, but that's the hope, that this transformation is visible through larger parts of the Middle East, and eventually Palestinians join it, even if they are the last Arabs to do so. It certainly will require Israel to keep its guard up, to make sure that not only is there not another October 7th, but continue the fight against terror in Gaza and in the West Bank, which is a daily fight. But that's the hope, that ultimately the transformation that we've seen in the last, say, 5 years is not defeated, but rather spreads and finally includes the Palestinians.
It's a lot to hope for. I appreciate you giving the encouragement to remain hopeful. And after reading your article and having conversations like these with various people, it can be discouraging at times. So I appreciate your reminder to hold on to some hope. I'll just summarize real quick some of my takeaways, because we've covered a lot of ground, but I think I want to just summarize and make sure that I've learned what you think are the correct takeaways from our conversation. I think it's important just to acknowledge that the situation is very, very complicated, easy to oversimplify, but it's much more complex, much less black and white than we often would like to think. Mm-hmm. It's important, if we're going to remain dedicated to and part of the solution, that we be both pragmatic and optimistic at the same time. It's a tall order, but I think it's what the moment requires of us, which is important to acknowledge, and that we are patient. I think one of the most impactful things in your article that I found most interesting as we think about young people, especially, who this podcast is primarily for, desperately want to be part of the solution when they see wrong or suffering in the world. But one of the things that stood out to me most about what you had to say and the advice that you've given is style over substance just doesn't work. And if you're in it for the popularity points or the photo op, then you're probably going to choose the wrong approach or take the wrong path. And it requires much more careful, discreet, and substantive work that often happens behind the scenes. You won't always get credit for it. And if you're only in it for the credit, then that solution may not be realized. So that's what I learned, at least. Is there anything that you want to add to that? Did I get anything wrong or miss anything that you want to make sure we emphasize?
Wrong. We have to. I just add. The people say the occupation, in quotes, meaning Israeli control of the West Bank, is unsustainable. It began in 1967. 58 years. So your listeners, even the ones who were older, weren't even alive when that happened. And it's folly, I think, to believe that we have a quick fix that's going to just, solve all of the problems overnight or next year. I would say, I don't know whether this is happy or sad, but for those of the listeners who are interested in these subjects, they'll be around. If you plan a career dealing with international things, whether it's in the government or it's in a charity, like Samaritan's Purse or whatever, these problems, unfortunately, will be with us. But that should not be an excuse for failing to try to deal with them, to ameliorate the situation, to make people's lives better, and to keep looking for ways forward.
I appreciate you saying that. Thank you. Thank you for your words of encouragement, as well as the immense amount of knowledge that you have to share with us. Really appreciate your time today, Mr. Abrams. Thank you also to our listeners for joining us. I hope that you've enjoyed this and have learned as much as I have. And as well, thank you to our behind the scenes crew here at Passages for helping make sure this podcast happens. We will be back next week, or actually later this week, with more about all the current events, including most likely what's happening at the UN. So until next time, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.